On Thanksgiving night, my son and daughter-in-law offered me a bowl of cranberry sauce, saying it was my late wife's recipe. I picked up a spoon and stopped. A few minutes earlier, when I got up to wash my face, I had inadvertently paused in front of the slightly ajar kitchen door and heard something no one was allowed to hear. I returned to the table, sat down as if nothing had happened, and at that moment I knew I had to pretend to have a heart attack because things had started to go off track. I'm so grateful to have you here. To help us connect, could you share where you're watching from which city or country? Also note that this story uses fictional elements for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the message remains deeply useful. The rhythmic scrape of the hand plane against white pine was the only soul in the workshop at 5 a.m. Silas Vane worked by the rhythm of the Atlantic, steady, relentless, and cold. Outside the Maine coast was a jagged silhouette against a bruised gray dawn, the kind of morning where the salt air bit through your lungs and tasted like iron. He was finishing the hull of a small dinghy, a project he'd started in July, back when he still believed his son's visits were born of affection rather than arithmetic. The vibration of his phone on the workbench shattered the silence. It skittered across the wood shavings like a nervous insect. "Silas!" Julian's voice crackled through the speaker, devoid of its usual warmth. "Caleb just sent the ferry confirmation. You're still heading out tonight, aren't you?" Silas didn't stop his stroke. A long, thin curl of pine spiraled onto his boot. "I'm going, Julian. The stage is set. It'd be a shame to miss the opening night." "The FBI is nervous, Silas. Calloway wants to make sure you're wearing the tie clip." "I'm a man of habit, Julian. You know that." Silas hung up and looked at the half-finished boat. He wouldn't finish it today. Maybe not for a long time. He walked back to the main house, a modest 2-bedroom salt box that smelled of old books and dried sea spray. To the neighbors in Rockport, Silas was just the retired carpenter with a rusted 2008 Ford F-150 and a quiet grief for his late wife Eleanor. They saw a man who bought his coffee black and his flannel shirts at the local hardware store. They had no idea that the man they pitied was the architect of an empire. He opened his closet. The clothes were laid out with military precision, an old Navy Oxford shirt pressed crisp, a gray tweed jacket Eleanor had bought him in 2009 for an anniversary dinner they'd spent watching the fog roll in over Portland, and the moss green wool tie. He had worn this exact outfit 6 years ago at Caleb and Sloane's wedding. Back then, he had looked at his son with a pride that now felt like a puncture wound. From the top drawer, he pulled out a silver tie clip. It was an elegant, understated piece, a wedding gift from Eleanor in 1983. In October, Julian had taken it to a contact in Boston. Now beneath the silver sheen lay a microscopic transmitter, a silent witness for the federal government. Silas sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the last 4 months pressing down on him harder than the Maine winter. It had started in August. Victor Dragan, a man whose name carried the stench of Miami's dark underbelly, had approached Caleb. A $10 million loan to cover Caleb's failing real estate ventures. Dragan wasn't a bank. He was a shark. He had recorded their meetings as insurance recordings Julian had intercepted weeks later. In them, Caleb didn't sound like a desperate son. He sounded like a predator. He spoke of an imminent inheritance, a windfall from a father he described as a senile old woodworker sitting on a gold mine. By September, the betrayal went deeper. Julian discovered Caleb had hired a private investigator to dig into the Rockport property lines, and more dangerously, the historical shareholding of Vane Maritime Group. For 20 years, Silas had kept the truth in the shadows. Vane Maritime Group was an $800 million behemoth, a fleet of 47 cargo ships born from a single shipyard Silas had started with his bare hands. He had stepped away from the CEO chair a decade ago, letting the board run the day-to-day while he lived a life of quiet labor. He wanted Caleb to build something of his own. He wanted his son to know the grit of a Tuesday morning before he knew the luxury of a Saturday night. "I wanted him to be a man, Eleanor," Silas whispered to the empty room. "I was wrong. I only taught him how to be a ghost." Caleb had stumbled upon the company name in 2022, but the boy's arrogance had been his own blindfold. He saw his father's name on old payrolls and assumed Silas had been a mid-level manager, a loyal servant who had retired with a modest pension. It wasn't until the PI returned in September that Caleb saw the true numbers. Silas owned 73% of the shares. After taxes, his stake was worth $584 million. That discovery had turned Caleb's greed into a fever. He felt cheated. He felt as though Silas had stolen 20 years of luxury from him by forcing him to live normally. The fever became lethal in October. Silas remembered the bottle of bourbon Caleb had brought over for his birthday. "Top shelf, Dad. You deserve the best." 2 glasses in the world had begun to tilt. His vision blurred, and his heart felt like it was trying to escape his ribs. Julian had insisted on a private doctor. The labs came back with traces of arsenic. Not enough to kill him, not yet, but enough to build a medical paper trail. That was the day Silas called Julian and told him to reach out to Special Agent Reed Calloway at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The Arsenic the Dragon recordings, the suspicious inquiries into the Maritime Group, it was a mosaic of a murder plot. Calloway had opened the file within 48 hours. Silas stood up and checked his reflection. He looked like the father Caleb expected to see, fragile, aging, and oblivious. He walked out to the F-150. The engine groaned against the cold, but turned over on the second try. He looked back at the workshop one last time. The unfinished dinghy sat in the shadows, a symbol of a life he hoped to return to. "I'll finish it," he muttered, regardless of how tonight ends. As he pulled out of the gravel driveway, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from Julian Calloway confirmed. "Team in position by 6 p.m. Ferry departs at noon. Safe travels, old man." Silas drove toward the harbor, the sun finally breaking the horizon in a streak of violent orange. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew the trap was set. What he didn't know was that the ocean he had lived by for 60 years was about to become much deeper and much darker than he had ever imagined. The ferry ride from Woods Hole to Vineyard Haven takes exactly 45 minutes. Most passengers stayed huddled inside the heated cabin, clutching expensive lattes and scrolling through their phones. I chose the outer deck. Even as the wind whipped off the Vineyard Sound at a biting 34 degrees Fahrenheit, I needed the cold. I needed the salt to sting my eyes, so I wouldn't have to admit they were watering for other reasons. I looked out at the slate-gray expanse of water and remembered 1987. Eleanor and I had taken this same ferry for a belated honeymoon. We had nothing then, just a few $100s in a shared checking account and a beat-up suitcase, but we had all the time in the world. Back then, the vineyard felt like a dream we were allowed to visit. Now, it felt like a graveyard decorated in white cedar and black shutters. As the ferry docked, the town of Edgartown appeared like a postcard of colonial arrogance. The captain's houses stood tall and pristine, their widows' walks looking out over a sea that had made and broken fortunes for centuries. A taxi picked me up at the terminal. The driver, a local who looked like he'd seen too many tourists, glanced at my weathered face and my old tweed jacket in the rearview mirror. He didn't realize he was driving the man who technically owned the destination we were heading toward. We pulled up to the estate in Edgartown, a 6-bedroom oceanfront mansion with a freshly painted cedar fence and wrought iron gates. The driveway was lined with crushed white shells that crunched like bone under the taxi's tires. I knew this house. I had signed the purchase papers in 2018 through a maze of subsidiaries, Vineyard Holdings, LLC, managed by Atlantic Maritime Trust, a silent arm of Vane Maritime Group. To Caleb, this was the crowning achievement of his independent success. To me, it was a line item on a balance sheet he wasn't supposed to see. Caleb was waiting at the gate. He didn't walk toward the taxi. He stood there checking his Patek Philippe, looking annoyed by the very presence of the rusted Ford F-15. Oh, that had dropped me off. When I stepped out, he gave me a quick, firm handshake, the kind you give a business associate you don't particularly like, instead of a hug. "You're late, Dad." Caleb said, his eyes scanning my clothes with a flicker of embarrassment. "The sea doesn't keep a schedule, Caleb," I replied softly. Then came Sloane. She drifted out of the front door like a ghost wrapped in gray cashmere. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, perfectly white, perfectly symmetrical, and entirely void of heat. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my lapels. "Silas," she said, her voice a practiced lilt. "Is that the suit from our wedding? You've kept it all these years. How sweet." It wasn't a compliment. It was a marking of territory. She was pointing out that while they had evolved into the elite of the island, I was still wearing the skin of a decade-old memory. Caleb frowned, his gaze dropping to my moss-green wool tie and the silver clip Eleanor had given me. "Dad, we have guests coming later, important people from the city. I thought you might have..." Well, at least you could have updated the wardrobe a bit. Sloane placed a manicured hand on Caleb's shoulder, a gesture of faux restraint. Oh, hush, Caleb. He looks quite dignified, like a character out of an old novel. Her words were sweet as honey, but they sat in the air like ice. I just nodded, feeling the weight of the transmitter in the tie clip. They were so busy condescending to the carpenter that they didn't notice the predator in the room. They led me on a tour of the house. It was a museum of curated wealth. Abstract paintings that cost $80,000 hung on walls of sea salt white. The kitchen featured a sub-zero refrigerator and marble countertops that had never seen a scratch. But as we moved through the rooms, I noticed what was missing. There wasn't a single photograph of Eleanor, not one. My wife's legacy had been erased to make room for minimalist vases and Swedish furniture. It's a beautiful home, Caleb, I said, my voice steady. A lot of overhead for a man in real estate. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'm doing well, Dad. Better than you think. During the cocktail hour, Caleb poured me a glass of Pappy Van Winkle 23-year. It was a $3,000 bottle of bourbon served in a crystal tumbler. He sat across from me in a leather wingback chair, trying to look like a man in control. You know, Silas, Caleb started swirling his whiskey. We've been talking. Rockport is getting lonely for you. The maintenance on that old house, the winters. Maybe it's time for downsizing. There are some incredible high-end retirement communities in Florida. Warm weather medical staff on site. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. I watched them. They exchanged a look, a sharp, synchronized glance that people only share when they are executing a plan. It was the same look they probably shared when Caleb poured the arsenic-laced bourbon back in October. I like the cold, Caleb, I said. It keeps the mind sharp. Julian called me, I added casually, watching for a reaction. He's on the island, staying at a B&B in town. He wanted to make sure I made it across the sound safely. Caleb's hand faltered for a fraction of a second. Julian is here. I didn't invite him to dinner tonight. This is a family affair. He's just doing his job, I said. I sat in the living room, the whiskey untouched in my hand. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I watched the sun begin to dip behind the Nantucket Sound. The sky turned a bruised purple, mirroring the cold water outside. The irony was suffocating. These two people were offering me expensive bourbon in a house they didn't know I owned, plotting to push me into a home while they stood on my foundation. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I felt a profound, hollow sadness. Dinner is almost ready, Sloane announced, her voice echoing from the hallway. I stood up, but as I approached the dining room, I paused. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. I heard Sloane's voice, hushed but urgent, cutting through the silence of the house. Was, Dragon's deadline is Monday, as she hissed. Tonight has to be a success, Caleb. No more cold feet. The door swung shut. I adjusted my tie clip, the silver cool against my fingers. Monday, I thought. 3 days left. I walked into the dining room with a smile that felt like a mask. I'm famished, I said. Let's eat. A sailor doesn't learn to read a storm from textbooks. They learn from the near misses. They learn from watching the water turn from a vibrant blue to a bruised hollow black seconds before a rogue wave hits. They learn from the way the air changes, a sudden heavy stillness that smells like ozone and wet iron an hour before the sky shatters. After 62 years of life and 40 of those on the water, I've learned that the most dangerous storms don't come from the Atlantic. They come from inside warm, well-lit houses where people are laughing, pouring expensive wine, and waiting for you to let your guard down. Dinner is served, Dad, Caleb said, his voice jumping an octave. He was hovering near the dining room archway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was sweating despite the air conditioning being set to a crisp 68 degrees. Sloane's outdone herself. Let's get seated before things get cold. In a moment, Caleb, I said, keeping my voice as smooth as polished driftwood. The ferry ride stirred up my stomach a bit. I'll just wash up. I turned toward the hallway, heading for the guest bathroom. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed the door wasn't fully latched. A sliver of warm golden light spilled onto the dark hardwood of the corridor. I stopped. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct honed by decades of navigating fog-bound coasts. When the wind shifts, you don't keep sailing. You listen. I reached up to my moss-green tie. My fingers brushed the silver tie clip, Eleanor's gift. I felt for the small, recessed notch on the underside and pressed it firmly. A microscopic red light, invisible to anyone not looking for it, pulsed once against my thumb. This wasn't a lucky coincidence. This was the culmination of a cold, calculated plan that Julian and I had architected back in October. When the labs first showed the arsenic in my blood, I hadn't raged. I hadn't confronted Caleb. Instead, I had handed this tie clip to Julian. "Fix it," I had told him. "I want Eleanor to hear what our son has become. I want her to be the witness I never wanted to be." Julian had installed a high-gain encrypted transmitter linked directly to a receiver in his B&B and, by extension, to Special Agent Calloway's recording suite. Since that day, I had worn Eleanor with me every single morning. Tonight, I needed her to listen with me. Through the gap in the kitchen door, I saw Sloane. She was standing at the marble island, her gray cashmere sleeves pushed up to her elbows. In her right hand, she held a small translucent glass vial. Caleb stood beside her, his face the color of parchment. Sloane tilted the vial over a crystal bowl filled with deep blood-red cranberry sauce. A fine white powder drifted down, disappearing instantly into the tart crimson liquid. She picked up a silver spoon and began to stir with practiced rhythmic strokes. "The arsenic will dissolve completely in the acidity," Sloane whispered, her voice devoid of any tremor. "He won't taste a thing. The bitterness of the berries masks everything." Caleb swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "How much is that? Is that enough?" "It's more than enough," she snapped, not looking up. "His heart condition will do the rest of the work for us. The doctors will call it a stress-induced cardiac event brought on by the travel. It's a clean narrative, Caleb." Caleb stared at the bowl as if it were a coiled snake. "What if it doesn't work fast enough? What if he realizes—" Sloane slammed the spoon against the side of the bowl. The sharp clink made Caleb flinch. "Dragan doesn't do what-ifs, Caleb. His deadline is Monday. If we don't have that first installment of the inheritance wired by noon, his people won't be calling next time. They'll be visiting, and they don't care about clean narratives." I stood in the shadows of the hallway, my heart beating with a slow, heavy finality. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the urge to run. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Arsenic in the cranberry sauce. A Monday deadline. A Romanian mobster breathing down their necks. Every suspicion I had carried for 3 months had just been confirmed in 90 seconds of hushed conversation. I walked quietly to the bathroom and closed the door. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the sound of running water mask my movements. I pulled out my phone and sent a 3-word text to Julian. Confirmed. Activate plan. The reply was instantaneous. "Copy that. Calloway is moving into position. I'll be at the front gate in 45 minutes. You know what to do." I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw the old navy shirt, the tweed jacket, and the silver clip glinting on my chest. I remembered the day Eleanor gave it to me 31 years ago. We were standing in the small garden of our first house, and she had clipped it onto my tie with a smile that could light up the entire coast of Maine. "Silas," she had said, "this is the piece that holds everything together." I had laughed then, thinking she was just talking about the fabric. I didn't realize she was talking about the man. I reached out and turned off the faucet. The silence of the house felt heavy, like the pressure change before a hurricane. Outside the door, I could hear the clatter of silverware and the sound of a chair being pulled out. "Dad!" Caleb's voice came from the end of the hallway, sounding forced and hollow. "Everything okay? Sloane just brought out the cranberry sauce. We're waiting on you." I straightened my jacket and smoothed my hair. I checked the tiny red pulse on my tie clip one last time. "I'm coming, Caleb," I called back. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who had survived 1,000 storms and knew exactly how to navigate this one. I opened the door and stepped toward the light of the dining room. I could smell the roasted turkey, the rosemary, and the sweet metallic scent of the betrayal waiting for me in a crystal bowl. I once stood on the deck of a commercial trawler during a Force 9 gale off the coast of Nova Scotia. The Atlantic was a wall of black glass sweeping over the gunnels and swirling around my heavy boots with enough force to snap a man's tibia. My legs didn't shake then. I have sat in mahogany-paneled boardrooms in Manhattan, signing merger contracts worth $200 million while the air conditioning hummed like an industrial freezer. My hands didn't tremble then either. But no step in my 62 years of life felt as heavy as impossibly burdened as those few yards from the guest bathroom down the hallway and into that dining room. I knew exactly what was waiting for me. I knew what was dissolved inside the small crystal bowl of crimson sauce sitting at the center of the table like a bloody heart. The dining room was a masterpiece of Edgartown elegance. Beeswax candles flickered in silver holders, casting long, dancing shadows against the sea salt white walls. The scent of slow-roasted turkey and rosemary filled the air, a domestic comforting aroma that had promised safety for generations of American families. Tonight, to my nose, it smelled like a funeral parlor. I took my seat at the head of the mahogany table, the chair creaking slightly under my weight. I wasn't just sitting, I was positioning myself for a siege. I noted the angle of the door, the reflection of the room in the silverware, and the exact distance between my plate and Caleb's shaking hands. "You look deep in thought, Silas." Sloane said, her voice like silk sliding over a blade. She sat to my right, looking radiant in her gray cashmere, the flickering candlelight masking the predatory coldness in her eyes. "I hope the travel across the Sound didn't tire you out too much. We want you to have an appetite." "Just thinking about how much things change, Sloane," I replied, my voice steady as a lighthouse beam. "And how much they stay the same." The meal began with a performance that would have put a Broadway lead to shame. Caleb played the role of the doting, successful son with a frantic energy. He poured a 2015 Bordeaux, a vintage that cost more than my first truck, with a hand that was just a bit too eager to please. They asked about the woodshop in Rockport, about the winter forecast in Maine, about the mundane details of a life they clearly viewed as a quaint relic of a bygone era. Sloane spun a glittering web of lies about their recent excursion to Napa Valley. She described private tastings at estates that required a year's notice and 5-star villas overlooking the vineyards. I listened, nodding at the appropriate intervals, while the heavy weight of the tie clip pressed against my chest. I remembered the report Julian had encrypted for me just weeks ago. Caleb's primary line of credit had been suspended at a boutique hotel in Boston. Their entire world was a hollow shell, a beautiful mansion built on a foundation of unpaid debt and desperate promises. The tide was coming in, and they were trying to swim with anchors tied to their ankles. "Actually, Dad," Caleb said, leaning forward after his second glass of wine. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Since we're all here together, I wanted to mention a unique investment opportunity. My fund is closing a major deal, high-yield, extremely fast turnaround. It just needs a final injection of liquidity to cross the finish line before the fiscal year ends." He looked at me with an expression that mimicked earnestness. Behind it, I saw the raw, jagged edges of a man who was drowning. I saw the shadow of Victor Dragan's Monday deadline looming over him like a guillotine. "Investments are like boats, Caleb," I said, cutting a small, precise piece of turkey. "If you rush the launch before the hull is sealed, everyone gets wet. I'd need to see the fine print." Sloane didn't join the talk of money. She remained focused on the turkey, carving thin slices with a surgical intensity. Her hands were steady, but I watched her eyes. Every 20 seconds, with the rhythmic precision of a lighthouse pulse, her gaze flicked to the crystal bowl of cranberry sauce. Then she made her move. With a slow, graceful sweep of her arm, she pushed the bowl toward me. The red sauce shimmered like liquid garnets under the candlelight. "Silas, you really must try the cranberry sauce," she said, her voice dropping to a register of practiced intimacy. I went through all our old storage boxes and found Eleanor's handwritten recipe, the one from the cookbook you gave us on our wedding day. I wanted tonight to feel like she was here with us. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. I froze, my fork hovering inches from my plate. Eleanor's recipe? She had taken the name of the woman I had loved for nearly 40 years, the woman who had given life to the man sitting across from me, and used her memory as a silencer for a vial of arsenic. The sheer cold-blooded audacity of it made my stomach turn. It was a level of depravity that went beyond greed. It was a desecration. "Eleanor's recipe." I repeated the words, tasting like copper. "That's quite a gesture, Sloane. She always said Thanksgiving wasn't complete without it." Caleb added, his voice thin and brittle. He wouldn't look at me anymore. He was staring into his wine glass, watching his own distorted reflection. "Go on, Dad. For Mom." He was using his mother's ghost as a lever to pry open my coffin. I picked up the heavy silver spoon. The weight of it felt monumental, as if I were lifting the anchor of a ghost ship. The room descended into a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Sloane stopped eating. Caleb stopped breathing. Neither of them possessed the courage to meet my eyes. That was the moment I knew with absolute chilling certainty. It wasn't the overheard conversation in the kitchen or the clinical coldness of the lab results Julian had shown me. It was the cowardice of their downcast gazes. A son who loves his father watches him eat with a smile. A son who is murdering his father watches the floor. I scooped a generous portion of the sauce and let it drop onto my plate. It sat there, a bright toxic stain against the white porcelain, looking more like a warning than a side dish. Just as I lowered the spoon, the phone in my vest pocket buzzed a sharp, discreet vibration against my ribs that felt like a heartbeat. Julian, in. Position outside the gate. Calloway's team 10 minutes out. Your call, Silas. I put the spoon down with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I didn't reach for my fork. Instead, I sat back and looked directly at my son. I waited until the silence became unbearable, until the tension in the room was a physical cord stretched to the snapping point. Finally, Caleb was forced to look up. You know what my favorite part of Thanksgiving is, Caleb? I asked softly. Caleb cleared his throat, his face pale and slick. The cranberry sauce, Dad. I smiled, a slow, cold expression that didn't hold a trace of warmth. It was the smile of a man who had finally seen the shore through the thickest fog of his life. No, I said. It's the part where the masks finally come off and everyone has to show their cards. Caleb's fork slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the china. Sloane didn't move, but her grip on her wine glass tightened until her knuckles were as white as the tablecloth. I don't understand, Dad, Caleb stammered. What cards? I reached up and adjusted my silver tie clip, making sure the microscopic red pulse was directed toward them both. Let's talk about Monday, Caleb. Let's talk about Victor Dragan. And then, let's talk about exactly what you've put in this bowl. People say acting is the art of intentional lying. I never thought I'd become an actor. I was a man of wood and salt, a man who believed that a straight line was the shortest distance between 2 points. But when your own son is hovering over you, waiting for the precise moment you stop breathing so he can inherit a ghost, sometimes a lie is the only thing that keeps you tethered to the world of the living. I reached into my pocket, my hand steady beneath the mahogany table. I didn't need to look at the screen. My thumb found the glass and swiped the pre-written message to Julian. Now. I looked at Caleb. He was vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy, his eyes darting between me and the blood-red sauce on my plate. Sloane was a statue of gray cashmere, her fingers laced so tightly with Caleb's under the table that I imagined their circulation was cutting off. Do you know what I miss most about your mother, Caleb? I asked. My voice wasn't an accusation. It was a soft morning truth. She never once asked me how much money I had. Not in 31 years. To her, I was just Silas. Not a balance sheet, not a safety net. Caleb flinched as if I'd struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked like a man trying to remember a language he had forgotten long ago. Then I began the performance. It started with a sharp, ragged intake of breath. I let my left hand fly to my chest, clutching the lapel of my tweed jacket right over my heart. I made sure my breathing became shallow, hitching in the back of my throat with the wet, desperate sound of a dying engine. My right hand, still holding the crystal wine glass, began to tremble violently. I tilted the glass just enough. The heavy Bordeaux spilled across the white linen tablecloth, spreading like an arterial spray, staining the fabric a deep, bruised purple. Then came the fall. I pushed back from the table, the chair leg screaming against the floor. I let my body go limp, channeling every memory I had of being tossed across a wet deck during a nor'easter. I knew how to fall, how to tuck the chin and loosen the joints, so the impact looked lethal but felt controlled. I hit the marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the high ceilings of the Edgartown mansion. The coldness of the stone seeped through my clothes instantly, but I remained utterly still. I closed my eyes and descended into the silence of a man who was no longer there. Dad. Nae's Caleb's scream was jagged, filled with a terrifying mix of horror, and if I wasn't mistaken, a sliver of relief. I heard the frantic scraping of chairs. Footsteps thundered toward me. I felt the vibration of the floor as someone knelt beside me, but they didn't touch me. Not yet. His heart, Sloane's voice cut through the air, sharp and clinical. She wasn't sobbing. She was managing the scene. Caleb, your father's heart condition and the stress of the trip must have been too much. I lay there, my pulse steady but hidden, listening to the predatory rustle of their panic. The sauce! I heard Sloane whisper, her voice dropping to a hiss. Look at his plate. Caleb, he hasn't touched a single bite. It's all still there. Get rid of it, Caleb rasped. Dump it in the disposal now. I can't, Sloane snapped back. I saw headlights through the gate. Julian is already here. Right on cue, 3 heavy, deliberate knocks thundered against the front door. They weren't the knocks of a guest. They were the authoritative strikes of a man coming to collect a debt. Caleb Sloan. It's Julian Thorne. Julian's voice boomed from the foyer, calm and unnervingly professional. I'm sorry for the late hour, but your father asked me to drop by this evening to witness some estate documents. I saw the lights were on and the gate was unlatched. I heard the frantic fumbling of the door lock. Caleb must have looked like a ghost when he opened it. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the dining room, his polished Oxfords clicking rhythmically on the marble until they stopped inches from my head. My God, Julian said, though his voice held the rehearsed gravity of a man who had seen this scene play out a dozen times in his mind. He looked down at me, then up at the table. I could practically hear him taking a mental photograph of the untouched cranberry sauce. Julian set his leather briefcase down on the table, mere inches from the bowl of poison. Caleb, don't move, Julian commanded as Caleb reached toward the table. I've already dialed 911. The paramedics are 4 minutes out. We cannot touch anything. This is a medical emergency, and the first thing they'll need to do is evaluate his last intake of food and drink. Everything on this table must remain exactly where it is for the toxicology report. Toxicology? Caleb's voice broke. It was just a heart attack, Julian. He just collapsed. It's just cranberry sauce. I understand your distress, Caleb. Julian said, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous tone of a lawyer with 30 years of experience in tearing people apart. But as your father's legal counsel, I am responsible for his person and his estate. If there is even a shadow of a doubt about what caused this collapse, I will ensure every grain of salt in this room is analyzed. Now step back from the table. I could hear Caleb's heavy, panicked breathing. He was trapped. The evidence, the blood-red bowl filled with Sloane's special recipe, sat like a ticking bomb between them. Julian had positioned himself perfectly, a blue navy wall of legal authority, standing between my son and his only way out. Sloane was silent. I could imagine her standing there, her perfect gray cashmere, suddenly feeling like a shroud, realizing that the clean narrative she had constructed was crumbling into a million jagged pieces. High in the distance, the first faint wail of a siren drifted across the Nantucket Sound. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic screaming of blue and red lights that began to pulse against the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the dark water outside. I lay on the cold stone, my breathing deep, and even hidden beneath the artifice of a dying man. I knew that the people in those vehicles weren't just EMTs. Calloway had spent 3 weeks prepping a specialized team for this exact moment. They weren't coming to save my life. I had already done that. They were coming to take what was left of my sons. They're here, Julian whispered, and for the first time I heard the cold, hard satisfaction in his voice. I kept my eyes closed, waiting for the doors to burst open. The performance was almost over, but the reckoning was just beginning. There are 2 types of uniforms that typically arrive at your doorstep in the dead of night. There is the kind that comes to pull you out of the wreckage, to restart a heart that has stuttered, to offer a sliver of hope when the world goes dark. And then there is the kind that comes to ensure the person who caused the wreckage has nowhere left to run. On that cold Thanksgiving night in Edgartown, I needed both, and Reed Calloway made sure I got them. The front doors of the mansion didn't just open. They were breached by a wave of urgent, disciplined energy. The blue and red lights of the ambulance outside pulsed against the white colonial columns, turning the pristine foyer into a strobe-lit crime scene. 4 men moved into the dining room. 2 were in the dark blue fatigues of Martha's Vineyard EMS, carrying a trauma bag and a portable monitor. The other 2 followed closely, moving with a quiet, predatory grace that had nothing to do with medicine. Among them was Special Agent Reed Calloway. He was dressed in a standard paramedic's jacket, but the way he scanned the room was all FBI. He had the close-cropped hair of a career Marine, a jagged white scar tracing his jawline on the left, and that unmistakable, gravelly Boston accent that suggested he'd spent more time in interrogation rooms than ambulances. While the 2 actual paramedics knelt beside me, Calloway drifted toward the dining table. He didn't look at the spilled wine or the half-eaten turkey. His focus was singular. He pulled a pair of blue latex gloves from his pocket, the snap of the plastic echoing in the hushed room. With the steady hand of a bomb technician, he picked up the crystal bowl of cranberry sauce. "Hey, what are you doing?" Caleb's voice was high-cracked with a desperation he could no longer hide. "That's just why are you taking the food?" Calloway didn't look up as he lowered the bowl into a heavy-duty plastic evidence bag. He sealed it with a clinical precision, his movements fluid and practiced. The standard protocol for a cardiac event during a meal. Calloway said, his voice flat and professional, devoid of any empathy. We need to secure any potential allergens or substances the patient may have ingested for the hospital toxicology team. It's for his safety. Sloane stood frozen by the sideboard, her hands pressed against her mouth. For the first time that night, the practiced mask of the Martha's Vineyard socialite slipped. Her eyes went wide, reflecting the flickering blue lights from outside as she watched her special recipe disappear into a labeled evidence bag. She knew. In that moment, she realized the clean narrative had just been bagged and tagged by the federal government. Calloway moved from the table to my side, kneeling where the paramedics were attaching EKG leads to my chest. He leaned in close, pretending to check my pupillary response with a penlight. FBI, he whispered the words intended only for my ears. Thorne's been feeding us the live audio from the tie clip. The sauce is secured. You're safe now, Mr. Vane. We've got the perimeter locked down. I gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months, far heavier than any heart condition, finally began to lift. The paramedics worked fast. I was hoisted onto a collapsible gurney, my body strapped down with nylon webbing. They fitted an oxygen mask over my face, the plastic smelling of ozone and sterile rubber. As they began to wheel me down the hallway, Caleb took a frantic step forward, his face slick with sweat. "I'm coming with him," Caleb shouted, reaching for the handle of the gurney. "That's my father." Julian Thorne stepped into the gap, his navy blue frame an immovable barrier. "They need room to work, Caleb. The air in that rig is for the patient and the medics only. You and Sloane should take your car and follow us to the hospital." Julian then turned toward two local Edgartown police officers who had arrived in the wake of the ambulance. He didn't ask. He commanded. "Officers, please stay here with the family until we have a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. It's a stressful night for everyone. I'm sure they'd appreciate the company." The officers nodded, stepping into the foyer and effectively sealing the exit. Caleb and Sloane were now trapped in a house they didn't own, surrounded by men in uniform who were no longer there to protect their secrets. The gurney hit the gravel driveway, the crushed white shells crunching under the wheels. The night air of Martha's Vineyard was bone-chilling, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dining room. I looked up at the sky. The stars were cold and distant, scattered like diamonds across a black velvet sea. As the medics pushed me past the front gate, I caught one last glimpse of my son. Caleb was standing under the glow of the porch light, Sloane's hand clamped onto his arm like a vice. They were watching the ambulance with expressions I had never seen before. It wasn't the grief of a son losing a father, or even the fear of a man being caught. It was the look of a gambler who had just realized the deck was stacked against him from the start, a cold, hard calculation of the next move. The back doors of the ambulance slammed shut with a heavy metallic finality. The interior was a world of white light and beeping monitors. The siren wailed to life, a high-pitched scream that cut through the silence of Edgartown. For the first time since I stepped onto the ferry at Woods Hole, I let out a long, shuddering breath. Calloway sat on the bench beside me, ripping off the latex gloves and tossing them into a biohazard bin. He reached out and adjusted the oxygen mask on my face, his expression grim. "The lab results on the sauce will take 4 to 6 hours for a formal confirmation," Calloway said, softly leaning in, so the paramedics who were now occupied with the radio wouldn't hear. "But our field kit doesn't lie. It's arsenic, Mr. Vane, and it's a concentrated dose, enough to stop a man's heart before the dessert was even served." He paused, looking at me with a strange, somber intensity. "There's one more thing," Calloway continued, pulling a small tablet from his jacket. "The recording device on your tie clip. It's been uploading to our server for weeks just like we planned, but Thorne found something in the archives from 3 weeks ago. Something recorded in the middle of the night, long before Caleb even sent the formal invite for tonight." I opened my eyes, fully looking at the special agent. 3 weeks ago?" Calloway nodded. "It wasn't a conversation. It was a phone call Caleb made while you were supposedly asleep in the next room during his visit to Rockport. You're going to want to hear this, Silas. It changes the motive. This isn't just about Dragon's debt." The ambulance sped toward the hospital, the lights flashing against the dark trees of the vineyard. I realized then that the storm I thought I'd navigated was only the beginning. The deepest part of the ocean was still ahead of me. It takes exactly 90 minutes to travel from the ferry terminal at Woods Hole to the heart of Boston, carving through the darkness of Route 93. Inside the back of the ambulance, the world was reduced to the sterile hum of equipment and the rhythmic thumping of tires against the pavement. Special Agent Calloway sat on the narrow bench opposite my gurney, a rugged tablet in his lap, and 2 cups of lukewarm, bitter cafeteria coffee between us. I had spent 3 months waiting for the moment the fog would finally clear. I had spent 3 months preparing for the worst. It turned out I still hadn't waited long enough to hear the depth of the betrayal. The audio from the tie clip is time-stamped, November the 7th, 2024. Calloway said his voice barely audible over the siren's distant wail. This was during your visit to Caleb's apartment in Beacon Hill. Julian had the system set to voice activation. It captured 40 minutes of background noise. But these 2 minutes, these are the ones that matter. Calloway tapped the screen. The recording was grainy at first, the sound of a dishwasher running the clink of silverware. Then the voices emerged sharp and clear, cutting through the static like a serrated blade. Sloan. The bourbon worked. He mentioned the dizziness on the phone last week. He thinks it's just his blood pressure acting up. Caleb. Are you sure? How much did you put in that bottle? Sloan. Just a microdose, Caleb. Enough to keep his heart stressed to mimic the symptoms of a gradual decline. At that level, it's invisible to a standard physical. It just looks like old age catching up. There was a long pause on the recording. I could hear Caleb's heavy breathing, the sound of a man standing on the edge of a precipice looking down. Caleb and Thanksgiving. We're really doing it then? Sloan, a full loading dose in the sauce. His medical history is already littered with reports of cardiac issues and dizzy spells thanks to the bourbon. No one performs an autopsy on a 62-year-old man with a documented heart condition who collapses after a long trip and a heavy meal. It's the perfect exit, Caleb, for him and for us. The recording cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than the ambulance itself. I stared up at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, my chest tightening, not from the phantom heart condition they had tried to give me, but from the cold clinical reality of their patients. The bottle of bourbon in October, the dizzy spells I had brushed off as exhaustion. Sloan hadn't just reacted to Victor Dragan's debt in a moment of panic. She had been cultivating my death for weeks, perhaps months, with the steady chilling patience of a gardener tending to a poisonous vine. And Caleb, my son, the boy I had taught to tie his shoes and navigate a sailboat, had stood by and watched the clock, waiting for the poison to take root. This recording, combined with the evidence we bagged in Edgartown tonight, moves this from a domestic dispute to a federal premeditated murder case, Calloway said, shutting down the tablet. They weren't just killing you for the inheritance, Mr. Vane. They were practicing for it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just watched the shadows of the Boston skyline flicker through the small tinted windows of the ambulance. By 10:45 p.m., we arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital. The transition was a blur of white hallways and the sharp scent of antiseptic. We bypassed the main ER, moving directly to a private wing on the 4th floor. Room 412 had been prepared with the precision of a stage set. Dr. Patrick Hale was waiting for us. He was a man Julian had trusted for 20 years, a cardiologist who knew the difference between a real heart attack and a political one. Within minutes, I was hooked up to a battery of very real monitors. A saline IV was started in my left arm, cold and sharp, and a nasal cannula was fitted back into place. To any observer, I was a patient in critical condition, hovering in the gray zone between life and death. But room 412 had secrets of its own. Calloway pointed to a small, unassuming reading lamp attached to the headboard. Tucked inside the casing was a high-definition low-light camera. Every word, every movement in this room is being streamed directly to a secure FBI server, Calloway explained. Julian is downstairs finishing the paperwork. He set the stage for their arrival. As if on cue, Julian Thorne stepped into the room. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been that morning, but his movements were as crisp as ever. He placed a thick, heavy manila envelope on the bedside table right next to the heart monitor. "The documents are ready, Silas," Julian said softly. "The trap is set. Everything we discussed, every contingency is inside this envelope. If they take the bait tonight, it's over." I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't need to. I knew Julian had spent the last 3 months preparing the ultimate corporate and legal strike. If Caleb and Sloan wanted my empire, Julian was about to show them exactly what that empire looked like when it turned its teeth toward home. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows, listening to the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. It was a haunting sound, a countdown to a confrontation I had spent my whole life trying to avoid. Sloan had started in October. They had been careful. They had been patient. They had used Eleanor's memory and my own body against me. But they had forgotten one thing: you don't survive 40 years on the North Atlantic without learning how to anticipate the strike. All their months of planning were about to collide with a single night of reckoning. "They're here," Calloway said, standing by the door and looking through the small glass pane into the hallway. "The elevator just hit the 4th floor. I recognize the walk. Sloan is in the lead." I adjusted my position, feeling the cold pull of the IV line. I closed my eyes, focusing on slowing my heart rate, matching my breathing to the artificial cadence of the machines. I became the man they expected to see, a broken, dying relic of a father gasping for his last few breaths. 3 minutes, Calloway whispered, stepping back into the shadows of the corner, where the camera couldn't see him, but he could see everything. I leaned into the darkness. I had waited 3 months for this. I had listened to them plot my demise in my own home. I had felt the poison in my veins. 3 minutes was nothing. The sound of high heels clicked rhythmically against the linoleum floor outside, growing louder with every second. Click, click, click. The sound of a deadline approaching. I drew one last deep breath and let it out slowly, letting my jaw go slack and my body go heavy. The door to room 412 pushed open. Sloan Mercer had once been the star of the litigation department at Hargrove and Associates in Manhattan, a shark in a $5,000 suit, before the state bar stripped her of her license in 2019. In her 7 years of practice, she had specialized in the dark corners of the law, contested estates, offshore asset transfers, and the kind of paperwork solutions that turn blood relatives into bitter litigants. I had spent the last month reading her redacted files in the quiet of my Rockport workshop. What Julian feared wasn't her intelligence. It was her fundamental lack of a moral break. She knew the exact razor-thin line between audacity and recklessness, and she possessed a pathological drive to cross it whenever the stakes were high enough. The sound of her heels reached me first, a sharp, purposeful staccato against the linoleum of the hospital corridor. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a woman who didn't walk through rooms. She occupied them. Caleb followed his footsteps heavier, dragging with a tactile reluctance that suggested he was finally feeling the crushing weight of the night. They stepped into room 412. According to Julian's choreography, the floor nurse had just been diverted to a emergency chart review, and Special Agent Calloway was a shadow at the far end of the hallway, invisible but watching through the digital eye of the reading lamp. They stood at the foot of my bed. I kept my breathing shallow, my eyelids shut tight against the harsh, sterile fluorescent glare. I felt their presence like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. They didn't reach out to touch my hand with comfort. They didn't check the heart monitor to see if I was still with them. Instead, their eyes swept the room with a cold, predatory efficiency, searching for anything that could be turned into leverage. The nurse said he's stable but non-responsive. Caleb whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Sloan, if he wakes up, if he remembers the dinner." "He's not going to wake up in any way that matters, Caleb." She snapped, her voice low and clinical. "The arsenic has already done the heavy lifting. His cognitive functions are compromised. Even if he opens his eyes, he's just a shell." I heard the rustle of fabric as they began a systematic search of my belongings. They went through my tweed jacket hanging on the back of the door, then my leather wallet. I knew exactly what they found: $47 in cash, a frayed library card from Rockport, and the small faded photograph of Eleanor I always kept behind my driver's license. Then Sloane's hand brushed the bedside table. I heard the faint metallic clink of the silver tie clip, Eleanor's gift being lifted. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced the monitor to maintain its rhythmic artificial cadence. She was holding the very device that had broadcast her every word for the last 8 hours. She held it inches from her face, looking for value. "Old junk," she muttered, tossing it back onto the table with a dismissive clatter. "He lives like a pauper while he sits on a kingdom." "It's not just stubbornness, Caleb. It's an insult to the lifestyle we're supposed to have. It's not just a kingdom, Sloan." Caleb said, his voice dropping as he looked at the blinking numbers on the monitor. The PEI wasn't exaggerating. Vane Maritime Group is valued at $800 million. He holds 73% of the voting shares. With the current market valuation and the hidden offshore holdings, it's $584 million after taxes. They stood there reciting those numbers over my dying body, as if I were already an itemized list on a probate document. To them, I wasn't a father or a man who had built a fleet from nothing. I was a frozen asset waiting to be liquidated. A sharp ping erupted from Sloane's phone. The silence of the room shattered. I heard her sharp intake of breath, a jagged sound of sudden visceral alarm. "It's him," she whispered. "Dragon. He's losing patience." I heard the rustle of her showing the screen to Caleb. I couldn't see the text, but I heard the raw terror in Caleb's voice as he read it aloud in a ragged breath. Monday, high noon. He says if the first installment isn't in the Romanian account, by then he's going to send a collection team to the island. Sloane, he's serious. He's going to kill us. Then we don't have time for the natural route. Sloane said, her voice hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve that chilled me more than the hospital air. We have to execute the transfer tonight. Right now, while he's still technically alive but legally incompetent. But the risks of a forced signature, the risk of doing nothing is a bullet in the head on Monday morning. Caleb, she hissed, her voice a whip crack. Listen to me. Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 201, D, Section 5, B. A medical power of attorney can be executed by a thumbprint if the patient is physically incapacitated and unable to sign. I've checked the statutes 3 times. We execute the POA. Now use the emergency authority to transfer his voting shares to the trust we set up in Delaware. And by the time the Vane Maritime lawyers wake up on Monday morning, the ownership is already legally moved. It'll take them years to untangle it in court, and by then Dragon will be paid and will be in a non-extradition country. "And if he survives?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. "If he wakes up and tells them he didn't authorize it?" Sloane moved closer to the bed. I could feel the heat of her presence, the scent of her expensive cloying perfume. "I'll speak with Dr. Hale. I'll tell him we want palliative care only. No aggressive intervention, no intubation. We let him slip away naturally into a cardiac rest. The dead don't testify in court, Caleb. They just leave legacies to the people smart enough to take them." She was scheduling my execution as if it were a routine boardroom meeting. The coldness was breathtaking. She wasn't just willing to let me die. She was actively ensuring I wouldn't survive the night to protect her forgery. I heard the zip of her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick stack of papers, the manila folder she'd been carrying like a weapon. I heard the pop of a plastic lid, the faint chemical smell of black ink filling the small space. "Hold his hand," Sloane commanded. "The right thumb. Keep it steady. If the print is smudged, it won't hold up in a challenge." I felt Caleb's hand take mine. His palm was soaking wet, trembling so violently that he nearly dropped my arm. This was my son, my flesh and blood, and he was currently prepping my thumb for the ink pad that would steal my life's work and seal my death warrant. I can't do this, Sloane." Caleb whimpered, his voice a pathetic thread of sound. "Do you want to die on Monday?" she whispered harshly, leaning over him like a vulture. "Because that is the alternative. Victor Dragon doesn't care about your feelings. Now, hold him down." Sloane moved toward the bed, the ink pad ready. I lay there counting my heartbeats, waiting for the cold touch of the ink. I thought about the manila envelope Julian had left in the drawer of the bedside table, the one Sloane hadn't even bothered to open because she was so blinded by her own supposed brilliance. Sloane Mercer was a master of the law, a woman who had checked the statutes 3 times. Nutning ko ta jen fem fai mot silam chetn goima bat kiluat sutrantung now kung kong juk fape mcfai ko ta choreng joi thukwa min jang choi kung mot tre choi voi kota. She thought she was stealing a kingdom. She didn't realize she was walking into a prison cell. "Almost there," Sloane whispered, her fingers cold as ice as they touched my skin. "Just one press, Caleb. Just one press and we're free." She reached for my thumb. My pulse stayed at a steady 60 beats per minute on the monitor. I remained the perfect victim, the silent actor in her final scene. But as the ink-soaked pad touched my skin, I knew that the script she had written was about to be burned to ashes by the very man she thought she had already killed. In my 40 years at sea, I learned that when a ship loses its anchor in the middle of a screaming gale, the most dangerous thing you can do is thrash about. You don't fight the North Atlantic with muscle. You fight it with stillness. You lie down, you breathe with the rhythm of the swell, and you wait for the precise moment the pressure shifts. On that cold November night in room 412, lying down and waiting took on a literal agonizing meaning. I had to remain a corpse while my daughter-in-law pried back my thumb to press it against a stack of legal documents that were supposed to be my death warrant. But there was a ghost in the room that Sloan Mercer hadn't accounted for. 20 minutes before the rhythmic clicking of Sloane's heels echoed in the hallway, Julian Thorne had entered room 412 through the service door near the nurse's station. He hadn't come to check my vitals. While Sloane was busy in the outer waiting area, charmed by her own sense of control as she spoke with a distracted night nurse, she had left her designer handbag on a vinyl chair. It was a lapse born of pure, unadulterated arrogance, the kind only a disbarred lawyer with a god complex could suffer from. In 60 seconds of practiced silence, Julian had opened that bag and performed a surgical strike. The manila folder Sloane now pulled out in the dim light of my hospital room wasn't the medical power of attorneys she had drafted in Boston. It was a mirror image on the outside, but the guts of it had been replaced. Julian had swapped her predatory document for one of our own, a confession of judgment in a set collateral agreement worth $10 million, structured under Massachusetts commercial law. Sloane, so sure of her brilliance, hadn't even bothered to double-check the fine print after reclaiming her bag. She assumed the world stayed exactly as she had left it. I felt her cold clinical fingers wrap around my wrist. My arm felt like a piece of waterlogged driftwood, heavy, limp, and unresponsive. This was the ultimate test of the art of staying still. Every fiber of my being wanted to flinch, to recoil from the touch of the woman who had put arsenic in my food. But I anchored myself to the steady beep of the heart monitor, turning my mind into a flat gray sea. "Hold the light, Caleb," Sloane whispered, her voice a sharp wire in the dark. I heard the pop of the plastic lid on the ink pad. Then I felt it, the damp metallic coldness of the black inking, as she pressed my right thumb down. The sensation was oily and invasive, a physical manifestation of her betrayal. Caleb stood by the door, his back turned to the bed, his shoulders hunched as if he could hide from the sin taking place behind him. He was the son I raised now, the lookout for my murder. Sloane didn't just press. She manipulated. She grabbed my thumb and rolled it with a practiced professional motion, clockwise then back, to ensure a clear forensic-grade print. I felt the dull ache in my knuckle as she forced the joint to bend at an unnatural angle. The smell of the ink, sharp and chemical, filled my nostrils. I counted my breaths, keeping them slow and shallow, even as the fury burned white-hot beneath my skin. 1 page, 2 pages, 3. The sound of the paper was crisp, a dry, skeletal rustle in the silence of the room. I wondered how many times she had done this before. How many grieving families had she dismantled with this same rhythmic, heartless efficiency in her days at Hargrove and Associates? Tonight, her expertise was her own undoing. "Got it," she murmured, a note of triumph leaking into her cold tone. I felt a sudden sharp sting as she wiped my thumb with a pre-packaged alcohol swab. She was rough, her movements hurried now that the heist was complete. She didn't notice that the ink was staining my skin in a way that wouldn't easily wash off a black mark of the betrayal she thought she was winning. She slid the folder back into her bag and zipped it shut with a sound of chilling finality. I heard her let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. To her, that sound was the sound of $500 million falling into her lap. To me, it was the sound of a prison cell door locking from the inside. She had just signed a confession that she owed my estate $10 million, secured by her own future assets. Caleb finally turned around. He walked to the side of the bed and looked down at me. For a second, just one fleeting second, I saw something flicker across his face that wasn't greed or desperation. It was a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looked like a man who had waded so deep into the black water that he could no longer remember the shore. He looked at my comatose face and didn't see a father. He saw a ghost he was too tired to haunt anymore. "Is it over?" Caleb asked, his voice a ragged shadow of itself. "It's just beginning," Sloane replied, her voice regaining its sharp, ambitious edge. She reached out and patted Caleb's shoulder, a gesture that looked more like an owner rewarding a dog than a wife comforting a husband. "Now, let's go find Dr. Hale. We need to make sure the palliative orders are signed before the morning shift arrives. We need to ensure nature takes its course before the lawyers get involved." They turned and walked out. The heavy door of room 412 clicked shut, leaving me in a darkness that felt thicker than before. I lay there for a full minute, listening to the silence. My right thumb felt frozen, the phantom sensation of the ink still clinging to the whorls of my skin. My mind raced back to the outer hallway. Julian had ensured that the folder in Sloane's bag was a legal confession, a document that once filed would tie her and Caleb to a debt they couldn't pay. By pressing my thumb onto those pages, Sloane hadn't authorized my death. She had authorized her own financial and legal execution. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The room was a blur of gray shadows and blinking green lights. I looked up at the small reading lamp attached to the headboard. I knew the microscopic lens of the camera was aimed right at me. I stared directly into it, a silent message to Julian and Calloway, who were watching the feed in a secure room only 2 floors away. I didn't sit up. I didn't rip the IV from my arm. It wasn't time yet. The storm hadn't fully passed. It had only reached the eye. Sloane and Caleb were on their way to see Patrick Hale, the doctor who was playing his part in this grand tragedy. They were going to ask him to kill me. They were going to ask him to sign the papers that would end my life naturally under the guise of compassion. I needed to hear them say it. I needed the final confession, the one that would make the arsenic look like a minor offense. In the eyes of the FBI, the poison was enough. But in the eyes of a father, I needed to see just how far my son would go to watch the light leave my eyes. I closed my eyes again and let my jaw go slack. The art of staying still was the hardest lesson I had ever learned, but tonight, it was the only thing that mattered. The black ink on my thumb felt like a brand, a mark of the man I had to become to survive my own son. One more act. I whispered into the empty room, my voice nothing more than a breath that wouldn't even register on the monitors. Just one more. Outside, the wind from the Charles River battered the hospital windows, a cold, mournful sound. But inside, room 412, the stillness was absolute. The trap was shut. The ink was dry. All that was left was the final curtain call. Julian had covertly embedded a microscopic earpiece into my right ear. At the same time, he'd modified the silver tie clip back in October, a piece of surveillance hardware so small it was practically invisible. As I lay in the sterile gloom of room 412, the world outside became a stage, and I had the front row seat to my own execution. I listened to Sloane Mercer present our care options to Dr. Patrick Hale in the hallway. Her voice was a masterpiece of manufactured grief. It wavered with perfect frequency, dipped into weary tones like a devoted daughter-in-law. If I hadn't spent the last 8 hours hearing the mechanical coldness of her soul, I might have actually believed she was afraid of losing me. We just want him to have peace, Doctor. Hale. Sloane's voice crackled in my ear, smooth as poisoned honey. Silas was always so proud. Seeing him hooked up to these machines. It's not what he would have wanted. Patrick Hale played his part with veteran patience. I understand. But these decisions shifting to palliative care or signing a do not resuscitate order require absolute certainty. We need to evaluate his neurological deficits first. We have the legal authority now. Sloane countered, her voice regaining its sharp, litigious edge. I heard the rustle of the manila folder, the one Julian had swapped. The power of attorney was executed tonight. He was very clear, no aggressive intervention. If his heart falters, we let nature take its course. I see, Hale replied neutrally. Let me take these documents to verify them with our legal department. It will take 15 or 20 minutes. Please wait here. Hale's footsteps receded, followed by a heavy silence before the hallway door clicked shut. Caleb and Sloane were alone. They thought the walls were thick enough. They thought the old man in the bed was a hollow shell. The loading dose from October should have been enough. Sloane hissed, the mask of grief finally dropping. His cardiac function was down to 60% last month. I don't understand why he's still holding on. He should have arrested on the ferry. He's stubborn Sloane. Caleb's voice was a ragged whisper filled with a hollow awe. He's always been like that. He survived a hurricane by lashing himself to a mast. You can't just flip a switch on a man like him. Well, the switch is flipped now, Sloane snapped. Once Hale agrees to the palliative transition, there won't be any more medical interference. Nature will take its course over the next 24 to 48 hours. With the arsenic already in his system, his heart will simply stop. It'll be a quiet, dignified exit. And then, Caleb asked, his voice trembling. And then we breathe, Sloane said, and I could hear the predatory smile in her voice. The Rockport house goes on the market Monday. Vane Maritime shares transfer to you within 30 days. And don't forget Eleanor's trust fund. My fingers tightened against the hospital sheets. Eleanor's trust fund. It was a small endowment, $200,000, that Eleanor had set aside for kids in Rockport who wanted to learn shipbuilding but couldn't afford tuition. It was a scholarship for dreamers, for those who saw the ocean as a future, just as I had at 17. Sloane had found even that. She had dug through 40 years of my life to find every cent of my wife's legacy and placed it on her balance sheet. Eleanor's trust dissolves into the primary estate if you are the sole heir. Sloane continued with sickening satisfaction. That's another $200,000 in liquidity to bridge the gap with Dragan. I've already updated the Excel file. Every cent is accounted for. Everything Eleanor left behind, the legacy of a woman who never asked for diamonds, who only wanted to help kids carve pine, Sloane had reduced to a cell in a spreadsheet. She was using my wife's charity as a bridge for a debt to a mobster. That was the moment the art of staying still became impossible. The cold fury simmering since Edgartown finally boiled over. I didn't need to hear another word. I reached up with my left hand and pressed the small button behind my ear, the agreed signal. Execute, I whispered into the empty room. My voice was a low growl that didn't even ripple the heart monitor. The silence lasted only 3 seconds. Then from the hallway came the sound of a storm breaking. It wasn't the clicking of heels, it was the heavy thud of tactical boots. I heard the sharp crackle of a radio shattering the peace of the 4th floor. Caleb Vane Sloane Mercer. It was Reed Calloway's voice, cold, hard, and final. I need to speak with both of you, right now. I heard Sloane's sharp gasp, then her defensive snap. Excuse me, who are you? This is a private wing. Special Agent Reed Calloway, FBI, he replied, and I heard the metallic clink of a badge. We are here regarding a federal investigation into conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud. We have a warrant for your arrest, and we are securing all items, including that handbag. This is a mistake, Caleb wailed in pure terror. Julian! Where is Julian? Mr. Thorne is with the district attorney, Calloway said. And as for the mistake, we've been listening to you for the last 8 hours, Caleb. From the kitchen in Edgartown to this hallway. I opened my eyes. The room was still dark, but the green lights of the monitors seemed more vibrant. I looked at the black ink staining my thumb, the mark of the trap they had walked into. Outside, the shouting faded as they were led away. I sat up slowly, the IV lines pulling at my skin. I turned on the reading lamp and stared into the hidden camera, my face reflected in the glass. Eleanor, I whispered, my voice finally breaking. They didn't get the trust. They didn't get a single penny. The door to room 412 opened and Julian Thorne walked in. He wasn't carrying a briefcase. He held a glass of water and a look of grim satisfaction. He sat by the bed in silence. The storm was over. The anchor had held. Before I reveal this confrontation, please comment the number 11, so I know you're still here watching the final developments. And note the following story contains some fictional elements for entertainment purposes. If you find it inappropriate, you can stop here. However, the lesson to come will be extremely valuable. They say the hour just before dawn is the darkest. I don't know if that's a meteorological fact or just a poetic comfort for the desperate. But I do know that at 12:47 a.m. on November 29th, 2024 in room 412 of Massachusetts General Hospital, the darkness didn't fade, it simply sharpened. I sat up. It wasn't the slow, groggy awakening of a sick man reclaiming consciousness. It was the deliberate, bone-deep movement of a hunter who had finished waiting in the blinds. The heavy oak door of the room pushed open. Special Agent Calloway led them in first. Caleb looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside his face, the color of damp ash, his hands cuffed in front of him. Sloane followed, her chin tilted up in a final, defiant reflex of the litigator she used to be. Her eyes were hard, scanning the room for a legal exit that no longer existed. Calloway stood by the door, a silent sentinel in a dark suit, his hand resting near his belt. He had already read them their Miranda rights in the hallway, the words echoing through the earpiece I still wore. You have the right to remain silent. They stood at the foot of my bed, framed by the blinking green monitors and the cold glow of the fluorescent lights. Sloane was already constructing her defense, her jaw set, her mind likely racing through statutes and precedents. She looked at the monitors, then at Dr. Patrick Hale, who stood silently by the window. Dr. Hale, Sloane said, her voice clipped and professional, trying to regain the high ground. This is a gross violation of privacy. My husband is in shock and his father is in a coma. Whatever these agents think, Hale didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and flicked a switch on the side of the heart monitor. The steady artificial beep, beep, beep that had defined the room for 2 hours simply vanished. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. I opened my eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't struggle. I opened them wide and fixed my gaze directly on Sloane. I wanted her to be the first thing I saw in this new brutal clarity. I wanted her to see that the shell she had been hovering over was inhabited by a man who had heard every whispered word, every clinical calculation of his demise. Sloane recoiled. It was a half step, a momentary lapse in her physical discipline, but in that small movement I saw her entire world collapse. Her breath hitched a jagged sound in the quiet room. Silas, she whispered the name, sounding like a curse. I sat up slowly. I reached over and peeled the EKG leads from my chest, the adhesive stinging against my skin, a welcome, honest pain. I pulled the IV line from the back of my left hand, a small bead of blood forming where the needle had been. I didn't look like a dying man. I looked like a man who was finally getting dressed for work. Dr. Hale stepped forward and handed me the navy Oxford shirt I had arrived in. I stood up, my legs steady on the cold linoleum. I put on the shirt, buttoning it with a slow, methodical precision. I wrapped the moss green wool tie around my neck and pulled the knot tight. Finally, I picked up the silver tie clip from the bedside table. I slid it onto the silk, the metal cool and familiar against my chest. "Dad!" Caleb's voice was a broken, pathetic thing. He was trembling so violently that the chain of his handcuffs rattled. "Dad, you weren't unconscious," I finished for him. My voice was raspy from the oxygen, but it carried the weight of 40 years on the water. "No, Caleb, I wasn't. I was right here. I heard about the bourbon in October. I heard about the loading dose and the cranberry sauce. And I heard about how you were going to bridge your debt to Dragan with your mother's scholarship fund." Caleb flinched as if I had splashed him with boiling water. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders shaking with silent, cowardly sobs. Sloane found her voice then. It was a desperate, grasping thing. "Silas, listen to me. Whatever you think you heard, audio recordings can be manipulated. They lack context. We were under immense pressure. We were trying to protect you from people like Dragan." I held up my hand, a simple, quiet gesture. Sloane's mouth snapped shut. The silence returned heavier than before. I walked toward the foot of the bed, stopping 3 feet from my son. I looked at him, not with the white-hot rage I had expected to feel, but with a profound, soul-crushing sadness. This was the boy who used to sit on my lap and ask me to tell him stories about the stars. This was the man who had just watched his wife prep his father's thumb for a forged signature. "I spent my life building Vane Maritime for you, Caleb," I said softly. "I kept it in the shadows because I didn't want you to grow up in the glare of money you didn't earn. I wanted you to have a soul before you had a portfolio." I took a breath, the air in the room feeling thin. "Julian has a file in his office. It's been there since your 30th birthday. It's a dedicated trust fund, Caleb, $50 million. It was designed to be your safety net, a way for you to start your own firm without the shadow of my name. All you ever had to do was ask me for help." The room went cold. Caleb looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide, with a new agonizing kind of horror. $50 million. The very amount that would have cleared his debts 10 times over, held in a drawer by the man he was trying to kill. Sloane's face went completely pale. For the first time in the entire night, I saw real unadulterated terror in her eyes. Not the terror of being caught, but the terror of the monumental, catastrophic waste of her own greed. She had planned a murder for a fraction of what was already legally destined for them. I reached up and touched the silver tie clip. "Eleanor's gift. Your mother gave me this on our wedding day," I said, my voice finally beginning to crack. "She told me it was the piece that held everything together. She meant the family Caleb. She meant the truth." I leaned in closer to him, ignoring Sloane entirely now. "She would have forgiven you for being a failure, Caleb. She would have forgiven you for being broke. But she never would have forgiven you for what you did to her cranberry sauce." Caleb collapsed. He didn't fall. He just seemed to dissolve his knees, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He buried his face in his cuffed hands and howled a sound of pure, shattered grief that echoed through the sterile halls of the hospital. Sloane stood over him, her face a mask of frozen stone. She knew it was over. There were no statutes to cite, no precedents to argue. The camera in the reading lamp had captured it all, the ink. the whispers, the intent. The door opened again. Julian Thorne stepped in, wearing his navy blue suit like a coat of armor. He held a thick manila folder under one arm. He looked at me, seeing me standing there in my tie and tweed, and he gave a single somber nod. The trap had worked. The evidence was absolute. Agent Calloway. Julian said, his voice echoing with the authority of 30 years of law. I believe we're ready to process the formal statements. The district attorney's office is standing by. Calloway stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder. Let's go. As they were let out, I stood in the center of room 412. I watched my son be escorted into the darkness of the hallway, a man who had traded 62 years of love for a spreadsheet that didn't add up. I turned back to the window. Outside, the lights of Boston were blurred by a sudden thin veil of sleet. The city was waking up unaware of the storm that had just broken in this small room. 62 years. I whispered to the glass, my reflection looking older than the sea. 62 years is a long time to wait for a storm to pass. Julian walked over and stood beside me. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer platitudes. He just placed a hand on my shoulder and waited with me in the silence. We're going back to Rockport in the morning, Silas, Julian said. Yes, I replied. I have a boat to finish. There is a specific kind of silence that occurs only when a person realizes that the entirety of their calculations has collapsed at once. It isn't a scream. It isn't the theatrical flow of tears. It is simply the silence of someone watching a building they spent years constructing layer by layer, with lies, with greed, with precision fold into the earth floor by floor. And the most terrifying part of that silence is the realization that they are standing right in the center of the wreckage and there is nothing left to do but stare. The air in room 412 was thick with the smell of ozone and the cold reality of the law. Julian Thorne didn't waste time with sentiment. He sat at the small bedside table and flipped open his laptop. The blue light of the screen reflected off his glasses, making him look like an impartial judge in a navy blue suit. Let's revisit the soundtrack of the evening. Julian said, his finger hovering over the trackpad. He pressed play. The high-fidelity speakers of the laptop filled the hospital room with a voice that was unmistakably Sloane's, recorded only hours ago in the kitchen at Edgartown. Sloane's voice: "The arsenic will dissolve completely. The bitterness of the berries masks everything. His heart condition will do the rest of the work for us." The recording was jagged, clinical, and devastating. Caleb flinched as if the words were physical blows, but Sloane remained motionless. Her lawyer's brain was already searching for a breach in the hull. "That recording," Sloane said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous rasp. "It's inadmissible. Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for wiretapping. You recorded that in a private residence without our knowledge. It'll never see a courtroom." Special Agent Calloway didn't even look up from his notepad. "Nice try, counselor, but you've been out of the game too long." Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 272. Section 99 allows for recording when there is a one-party consent in cases involving a clear and present danger of a felony, or when the recording party is the victim of a crime in progress. Mr. Vane was the target of a murder plot. He consented to the recording on his person. It's not wiretapping Sloane. It's evidence of a capital crime. Julian then reached into the manila folder and pulled out the document Sloane had executed only 20 minutes prior. He laid it flat on the table, turning it so the black ink of the thumbprints faced the light. "Let's look at what you actually signed," Julian said. He read the header with a slow, rhythmic finality. "Acknowledgement of debt and asset collateral agreement. $10 million secured by the total personal and business assets of Caleb Vane and Sloane Mercer Vane." Sloane stared at the page. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the text with a frantic, desperate speed. She looked at the thumbprints, her own, and Caleb's clear and forensic grade. Then she looked at Silas. That's not the document I drafted," she whispered. "That's impossible. I kept it in my bag. I didn't take my eyes off that bag all day." "Actually, you did," Silas said. He spoke for the first time, his voice quiet, but filled with the authority of a man who had survived a storm. 20 minutes before you arrived at Mass General, you left your bag on a chair in the waiting area to speak with the night nurse. You wanted to play the role of the concerned daughter-in-law. You wanted an audience. Julian picked up the thread, his voice steady. "I entered this room through the service door, swapped your folder for this one, and left. You walked in here so blinded by your own arrogance and the pressure from Victor Dragan that you didn't even bother to check the first paragraph. You took your own hand, Sloan, and you pressed your own thumb onto a legal confession of $10 million in debt. Sloan stood up abruptly. The heavy plastic hospital chair toppled backwards, slamming against the floor with a sound that made Caleb jump. Her face was no longer a mask of stone. It was a map of pure, unadulterated fury. "You trapped us!" she hissed, her finger pointing at Silas. "You orchestrated this whole charade. You lied about your condition. You used a federal agent to bait us." "No, Sloan," Silas replied, looking her directly in the eye. "I didn't trap you. I simply gave you enough rope. I provided the stage, but you and Caleb. You wrote the script. You brought the arsenic. You brought the greed. I just made sure the cameras were rolling when you performed." Caleb slumped into the remaining chair. His legs seemed to have lost the ability to hold him. The weight of the evening, the failure of the murder, the arrest, and now the realization of the $50 million he had traded for a prison cell was crushing him. $50 million, Caleb muttered, his eyes vacant. "You said there was a trust. $50 million. Silas looked at his son, seeing the broken shell of the man he had hoped would carry his name. "There was Caleb. It was built on 30 years of my labor and your mother's belief in you, but a trust is built on exactly that trust. Whether that fund exists in the future or remains a ghost of the past depends entirely on how much of the truth you are willing to tell Agent Calloway tonight." Calloway stepped forward, 2 sheets of paper in his hand. He didn't look at Caleb with pity. He looked at him as a case file. "Caleb Vane, Sloan Mercer Vane, you are formally under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted first-degree murder, and aggravated financial fraud. You will be transported to the federal holding facility in Central Square." Sloan didn't look at the agent. She didn't look at her husband, who was currently weeping into his cuffed hands. She looked only at Silas. Her eyes held no remorse, no sudden realization of her own evil. Instead, there was a cold clinical recognition of a superior tactical move. "Well played, Silas," she said, her voice a razor-thin line of ice. "I didn't think a carpenter had it in him." "I was a shipbuilder long before I was a carpenter, Sloan," Silas replied. "I know how to find the rot before the ship sinks." As Calloway began to lead them out, the heavy metal of the handcuffs clinking with every step, Caleb stopped. He turned his head, looking back at Silas one last time. He looked small, half the size of the man who had walked into the dining room in Edgartown. He looked like a 39-year-old child in a crumpled Brioni suit, his hair disheveled, his life a wreckage of his own making. "Dad," Caleb started, his voice a broken thread. Silas looked at his son, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders through the snow. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer a promise of a lawyer. He just met Caleb's gaze with a look that contained the weight of 39 years. "I know Caleb," Silas said. 2 words. They were an epitaph for a relationship that had died long before the arsenic was ever poured. They were the sound of a father realizing his son was a stranger, and a son realizing his father was a king he could never overthrow. The door to room 412 closed behind them. The silence returned, but this time it was the silence of a house after a storm broken, but finally still. Julian closed his laptop and exhaled. "It's over, Silas." Silas looked at the black ink still staining his right thumb, the mark of the man he had to be to survive. "No, Julian, the arrest is over. The rest is just beginning." Room 412 became preternaturally quiet after the heavy click of the door signaled their departure. The frantic energy of Caleb's terror and Sloane's calculated fury had evaporated, leaving only Julie and myself, the pale amber glow of a reading lamp, and a stack of folders thick enough to erase 15 years of the lives they had meticulously built. Or rather, the lives they had built on borrowed time, borrowed money, and layers of corporate shell games they mistakenly believed were impenetrable paper walls. Julian spread the asset structure diagram across the hospital overbed table. To an outsider, it looked like a complex naval chart of a treacherous coastline. To me, it was a map of how I had kept my son in a playpen without him ever realizing there were bars. "He never understood the plumbing, Silas," Julian said, tapping a pen against a box labeled Vineyard Holdings LLC. "He thought because his name was on the mailbox in Edgartown, he owned the dirt beneath it." I looked at the diagram. The logic was cold and circular. Vineyard Holdings LLC owned the oceanfront estate at Martha's Vineyard, but Vineyard Holdings was a subsidiary of the Atlantic Maritime Trust. That trust in turn was controlled by Vane Maritime Group. And since I held 73% of Vane Maritime, the house Caleb used to host his lavish parties, the house where he sat and plotted my murder over a glass of $3,000 bourbon, was and always had been mine. The irony was a bitter pill. Every luxury Caleb had flaunted to make me feel small, every square foot of cedar and marble he'd used to condescend to the old carpenter, had been paid for by the very man he was trying to put in the ground. And Vane Capital Partners, I asked. The same story, Julian replied. Caleb's investment fund only exists because its operating license was backed by a guarantee from Northeast Maritime Holdings. Another one of your shells. Without that backstop, the fund is a legal ghost. It wouldn't survive a single audit by the SEC. I didn't do this out of a desire for petty control. I did it because it was the only way I knew how to protect what Eleanor and I had built. I wanted to ensure that no matter how many wrong turns Caleb took, he couldn't burn down the whole forest. I had built him a life of paper walls thinking they would keep him safe. I never imagined he would try to burn them down from the inside just to see the sparks. I picked up the fountain pen Julian offered. My carpenter's hand, calloused and steady, felt the unfamiliar weight of the gold nib. Each signature was a closing door. First, the formal notice of seizure for the Edgartown estate, effective immediately, forfeited due to breach of the trust's moral and legal conduct clauses. Second, the withdrawal of the Northeast Maritime Guarantee. With one stroke of ink, Vane Capital Partners ceased to exist as a legal entity. Every trade, every account, every high-rise office lease was now null and void. Third, the freezing of all joint accounts held by Caleb and Sloan, executed through the preliminary federal injunction Callaway had secured hours ago. Every signature is a wall coming down, I muttered. I signed them all without a moment's hesitation until I reached the last sheet of paper. It was a single page shorter than the rest. A formal revocation of the $50 million trust fund I had established for Caleb's future. Julian looked at me, his eyes tired but sharp behind his spectacles. You don't have to sign that one tonight, Silas. The arrests alone have frozen his access. We can wait until the morning. I looked at the paper. This was the safety net Eleanor had wanted for him. This was the last chance fund. I thought of Caleb's face in the dining room, the way he had used his mother's memory to push a bowl of poison toward me. I thought of the ink on my thumb. I didn't sign it. I pushed it to the side of the table, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft from the hospital's ventilation system. Rockport and Eleanor's scholarship fund. I said, my voice low. They didn't get near them. They never had a chance, Julian assured me. Those are in your direct name, Silas. No shells, no trusts. They were looking for the millions hidden in the offshore accounts. They never bothered to look at the simple things right in front of them. Greed always looks for the complex solution. I nodded. There are some things you don't hide behind paper walls. The things that matter stay in the light. Julian closed his laptop with a quiet thud. He looked at his watch, then back at me. Victor Dragan contacted our Boston office at 3 this morning. He knows about the arrests. News travels fast in his circles. I wasn't surprised. A man like Dragan has ears in every precinct and every holding cell. What does he want, Julian? A meeting. Today, he's in Boston. He says he has something you need to hear, something that isn't on the recordings. I looked out the window. The sky over Boston was shifting from the deep hollow black of midnight to a bruised cold gray. It was the early hours of Black Friday. Most of the city was sleeping or lining up for sales, unaware of the debt that was being called in across the street. Dragan isn't a fool, I said. He knows his $10 million collateral just turned into a federal prisoner. He's looking for a new benefactor. Or a way to stay out of the same cell, Julian added. Where do you want to meet him? Tell him the waterfront, near the old piers. If we're going to talk about the end of a family, I want to smell the salt. I sat back against the pillows, the weight of the night finally starting to settle into my bones. The paper walls were gone. My son was in a cage of his own making, and now I had to deal with the shark that had been circling the wreckage. 62 years, I whispered to the empty room. I've spent 62 years building things. I never thought I'd spend my last few years tearing them down. Julian stood up, gathering the signed folders. Sometimes you have to clear the rot to save the timber, Silas. You know that better than anyone. I looked at the unsigned trust document sitting alone on the table, The paper wall was still standing just barely. I wondered if there was enough wood left in Caleb to rebuild anything at all. Black Friday, the day America collectively loses its mind, storming the aisles of Walmart and Best Buy for discounted televisions and kitchen appliances. It's a day built on the frantic pursuit of savings. But on that Friday morning, while the rest of the country was busy counting their nickels, Vane Capital Partners was receiving an emergency cease and desist from the Massachusetts Division of Banks, and the oceanfront estate at Martha's Vineyard was being served with a formal notice of seizure for breach of trust. I sat in room 412, drinking hospital coffee, the worst swill ever brewed by man, and watched the notifications scroll across my phone like a digital obituary. At 8 a.m., Julian's voice came through the speaker, crisp and devoid of fatigue despite the hour. "It's done, Silas. The fund's accounts are locked. Every trade Caleb authorized in the last 48 hours is under federal review. Sloane's personal holdings have been flagged for suspicious activity. They're effectively broke as of 10 minutes ago." I stared at the steam rising from my cup. "And the house?" "The local sheriff in Edgartown served the papers at dawn," Julian replied. "Sloane's designer luggage is still in the hallway, but the locks are already being changed. She doesn't have a home to go back to Silas, not even if she makes bail." By 9 a.m., Special Agent Calloway checked in. His voice held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally pinned a difficult target. "The lab confirmed it, Silas. The arsenic concentration in that cranberry sauce was high enough to induce acute cardiac failure in a man half your age. Combined with the earpiece recordings and the November 7th audio, the grand jury is looking at a slam-dunk attempted first-degree murder conspiracy and aggravated fraud. And because of your age and the nature of the poison, I'm adding a charge of felony elder abuse against Sloane. She's looking at 25 to life." I set the phone down. Elder abuse. The term felt clinical, a legal label for the woman who had smiled at me across the dinner table while calculating the speed of my heart's final beat. The strategy behind meeting Victor Dragan became clearer as the morning sun hit the hospital windows. With Caleb behind bars, Dragan had lost his primary debtor. He had $10 million floating in the ether, and men like Dragan don't accept losses. However, the acknowledgement of debt, with the fresh thumbprints the document Sloane unknowingly executed, was a powerful civil instrument. In the right hands, it was a claim on whatever assets Caleb had left. Dragan wasn't coming to offer condolences. He was coming to salvage his investment, and he knew I was the only man with the keys to the vault. Dr. Patrick Hale entered the room at 10 a.m. He didn't look like a conspirator anymore. He looked like a doctor, happy to see a patient recover so quickly. "You're cleared, Silas. Your vitals are perfect, better than mine, actually. No signs of residual toxicity." "Thank you, Patrick, for everything," I said. I moved to the small closet and took out my clothes. I dressed slowly, putting on the same outfit I'd worn to the brink of death, the navy Oxford, the gray tweed jacket Eleanor had bought me in 2009, and the moss green tie. I slid the silver tie clip back into place. This suit had done more work in 24 hours than any tuxedo I'd ever owned. It had been my armor, my recording studio, and my witness. Calloway met me in the hallway as I was signing my discharge papers. He gave me a firm, respect-filled handshake. "I've spent 20 years in financial crimes, Mr. Vane. I've seen thousands of schemes, but I've never seen a man navigate a betrayal this deep with such surgical precision. You didn't just survive, you dismantled them." "I wasn't playing a game agent," I replied, looking him in the eye. "I was just trying to stay above water." Julian was waiting by the door of room 412. He was already holding a new file, the Dragan file. "The Rockport house is secure, Silas, and Eleanor's scholarship fund is untouched. Both were held in your direct name from the beginning." "They never even saw them." I nodded, looking around the room one last time. The heart monitor was dark and silent. The reading lamp, once the perch for a hidden FBI camera, was just a lamp again. The white sheets were pulled tight and empty. "Room 412, I whispered. "I'm going to remember that number." We walked toward the elevators. The hospital was waking up, the shifts changing, people rushing to start their holiday weekend. As we stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the Boston morning, I felt the first real sting of winter. I stopped at the edge of the parking lot. In a shadowed corner, far from the main entrance, a black Mercedes sat idling. The windows were tinted to a total impenetrable black. Julian stopped beside me. "That's him. He's been there for 20 minutes. He's early, I noted. Victor Dragan is never early and never late. Julian said, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He arrives exactly when the situation requires his presence. I watched the dark car for a long moment. Dragan knew the board had been cleared. He knew his $10 million collateral was sitting in a federal holding cell. And yet, here he was, waiting in the cold. It seems he's learned how to read the weather, too. I said, my voice barely a breath in the wind. I adjusted my jacket and began to walk toward the Mercedes. The paper walls were gone. My son was in a cage, and the last shark was waiting for his turn. It was Black Friday, and I was about to find out exactly what the remaining pieces of my life were worth. Victor Dragan did not have the appearance of a dangerous man. That I realized as I stepped into the warmth of the Paramount Cafe was exactly what made him the most lethal. He was 52, with silver hair cropped into a precise military fade, and a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first 3 boats combined. His voice when he finally spoke carried a soft Bucharest lilt that drifted through the air like a thin trail of cigarette smoke. He sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, spine perfectly straight, hands folded neatly on the laminate surface. No phone, no bag, no nervous tics. Just a man waiting for a business partner to arrive. Julian remained outside, a silent shadow near the brick entrance. I walked to the table and pulled out the wooden chair. Dragan didn't look up immediately. He just pushed a cup of black coffee toward my side of the table. "Sit, Mr. Vane," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were the color of stagnant harbor water. "The coffee here is surprisingly honest, a rarity in this city." I sat. I made no effort to hide my right hand or the silver tie clip pinned to my moss-green wool. Dragan's gaze flicked to the clip, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. A cold, fleeting thing. "Oh, still recording, I assume?" Dragan asked. "Always," I replied. "Good. I want this recorded. Clarity is the foundation of a successful exit strategy." Dragan didn't waste time with the social niceties that Caleb and Sloan had spent all night weaponizing. He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the small space between us. "I am not here to threaten you, Silas. I am here because your son told me something in August that I have only now realized was a categorical lie. And I do not enjoy being the victim of a poor investment." "What did he tell you, Victor?" "That his father was a retired carpenter living on a modest pension in a drafty house in Maine." Dragan said, his voice flat. "He spoke of a valuable piece of coastal land, yes. He said he would receive his inheritance, his exact words, within 6 months. Based on that narrative of a simple old man and a $1.5 million property, I moved $10 million into his account to float his failing ventures. I perform due diligence on everyone who owes me money, Mr. Vane, but I can only verify what is presented to me. Your son presented me with a ghost." I watched him. Dragan's frustration wasn't born of morality. It was born of professional embarrassment. Caleb had played him. Caleb never mentioned Vane Maritime Group. Dragan continued, his eyes narrowing. He never mentioned $800 million in assets or 47 cargo ships. He came to me with a story about a simple woodworker, because he knew that if I saw the true scale of your empire, I would never have let him lead the dance. He wanted me to believe you were an easy target, a man who could be moved off the board without a ripple. "But you didn't know about the poison," I said. It wasn't a question. "I knew he needed the money quickly," Dragan replied firmly. "I knew he intended to seize your assets by any means necessary. But I did not know his plan involved a vial of arsenic and a Thanksgiving dinner. That is not the type of business I conduct. Murder attracts a specific kind of federal attention that is bad for the long-term health of my organization." I studied him across the table. Dragan was telling the truth, or he was the finest actor I had ever encountered. Probably both. But his motivation was as clear as the winter sunlight hitting the window. He needed my cooperation. With Caleb and Sloan in federal custody, their assets were frozen, tangled in a web of criminal proceedings that could take years to untangle. Dragan's $10 million was currently locked in a vault he couldn't reach. "So, you need me to unlock the door," I noted. "We may need each other, Silas," Dragan said. "The FBI has the sauce. They have the earpiece recordings from last night. But they don't have the history. They don't have the proof of intent that stretches back to the beginning of this summer." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me with a single finger. I stared at it, a tiny sliver of metal that held 3 months of a son's betrayal. From August to November, Dragan said. Every meeting, every phone call Caleb made to my office. He spoke of his intent to bypass you, to restructure the trust, to leave you with nothing. He never mentioned the poison to me, but he mentioned the greed. He laid out the motive for every federal prosecutor to see. Why did you record him? I asked. Drogon took a slow sip of his coffee. Because I have survived as long as I have by never trusting anyone completely. Especially not men who are desperate enough to borrow $10 million from a man like me. I kept those recordings as leverage against Caleb. Now, I am offering them as a bridge to you. I looked at the USB drive. It sat there on the laminate table, a digital witness to the slow rot of my family. The FBI will keep Caleb's assets in limbo for a decade, Dragan said. But you own the parent company. You have the acknowledgement of debt document with their thumbprints from last night. If you settle Caleb's debt to me directly, I disappear. I hand over the original files, I testify through a shielded deposition if necessary, and I let you finish the cleanup in Rockport without interference. I finally picked up my coffee, the heat of the ceramic seeping into my calloused palm. I looked past Dragan, out at the busy Boston street where shoppers were rushing to find bargains. Mr. Dragan, I said, my voice low and steady. Exactly what is it you expect to receive in exchange for this insurance policy? Dragan didn't blink. I want my $10 million plus the agreed upon interest. And I want the assurance that when the Maritime Group's ships dock in Miami next month, they do so under the management of someone who understands the value of a quiet partnership. I don't want your empire, Silas. I just want my seat at the table restored. I looked at the USB drive, then back at the man they called a shark. The storm was far from over. I had cleared the house of the vermin, but now the landlord of the shadows had come to collect the rent. I'll consider it, I said. But first I need to hear what my son said about me when he thought I wasn't listening. Dragan nodded and stood up, smoothing his jacket. The first file is labeled August 14th. It's the day he decided you were no longer a father, Silas. It's the day he decided you were just an obstacle. Enjoy your breakfast. He walked out of the cafe without looking back, leaving me alone with the coffee and the ghost of my son's voice trapped in a silver stick. I have signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars in my life. I have sat through negotiations that lasted 3 days and 3 nights in windowless boardrooms from Rotterdam to Singapore and Lagos. But none of those high-stakes maneuvers felt as consequential as the conversation occurring in this salt-stained, unremarkable cafe. Because this time, the commodity being pushed across the table wasn't currency, and the price wasn't measured in profit margins. It was measured in the cold, hard remains of a father's hope. Victor Dragan didn't haggle. Men of his caliber find the act of bargaining beneath them. They prefer the clean strike of a fair price. He leaned in his charcoal suit jacket, brushing the edge of the laminate table. $10 million, Dragan said, his voice a low, steady hum. The principal amount. No interest, no penalties, no additional clauses. In exchange, I hand over the original USB and provide absolute silence regarding my financial history with Caleb. To the world, I was never in Edgartown. I was never in Rockport. I looked at him, my mind already running the legal math. The acknowledgement of debt you holds already gives you a civil claim, Victor. You could take it to court. Dragan's eyes flattened. A civil claim in a federal murder case that would be tied up in the courts for 3 to 5 years, while your son's assets are frozen in a dozen different jurisdictions. I don't want a legal battle, Silas. I want my liquidity restored. You can resolve this today with a single wire transfer from Vane Maritime, a drop in the ocean for a man of your standing. I glanced toward the window. Julian was standing on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the biting November air. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He knew what I knew. 10 million was a rounding error against a $584 million empire. Dragan knew it too. This was a fair tax for cleaning up the mess Caleb had invited into our lives. The USB first, I said. Dragan didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and placed the silver drive on the table. I do not work on trust, Silas. I work on mutual interest. Your interest is the evidence of premeditation that goes back to the dog days of August. My interest is being made whole. We are both men who appreciate a clean horizon. I picked up the drive. It was smaller than my thumb light as a feather. yet it contained the weight of 3 months of my son's betrayal. When Caleb sat across from this man in August and spoke of the old carpenter he intended to replace, he was writing his own epitaph. He just didn't realize the ink was already dry. I reached up and touched the silver tie clip on my chest. "This recorded our conversation today, Mr. Dragon. You understand that, don't you?" Dragon looked at the clip, and for the first time a genuine appreciative smile ghosted across his face. "I assumed as much. It is a beautiful piece of equipment, discreet, elegant." "My wife gave it to me," I said. Dragon nodded once, a silent acknowledgement between two men who understood that even in a world of sharks there are anchors we do not cut. A brief, heavy silence settled between us, the kind that exists when everything that needs to be said has been stripped to the bone. "Deal," I said. We didn't shake hands. In our world, a handshake was for people who still believed in gestures. For us, the deal was the reality. Dragon stood up, smoothed his charcoal lapels, and gave a slight respectful inclination of his head. He walked out of the Paramount Cafe without looking back, his silhouette disappearing into the Black Friday crowds on the sidewalk. He had what he wanted, a path back to his own shadows. Julian entered a moment later, taking the seat Dragon had vacated. He looked at the silver USB sitting on the table between us. "Calloway is going to want that Silas." "He'll get it," I said. "But I'm going to listen to it first." Julian looked down at his hands, not with the practiced stillness of a lawyer, but with a strange, hesitant weight. "Silas," he began, his voice dropping an octave, "there is something I should have told you 6 months ago, perhaps even longer." I set my coffee cup down, the ceramic clink, loud in the quiet booth. "What is it, Julian?" "Eleanor," he said. She knew, not about the poison of course, but she knew the rot was starting in Caleb. She saw the way he looked at the business, the way he viewed people as stepping stones. "She wrote you a letter before she passed. She asked me to keep it, to guard it, and only give it to you when the storm finally broke." I sat in a stunned silence that felt like a physical blow. 30 years of marriage, 8 years of widowhood, and Julian had held this secret for nearly a decade. Eleanor knew, she prepared for this. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his navy blue overcoat and pulled out a plain white envelope. It was slightly yellowed at the edges, a relic from 8 years ago. Eleanor's handwriting was clear on the front, to Silas. "Open this when you need to." I didn't reach for it immediately. I just stared at it, the familiar curves of her letters bringing a sudden sharp ache to my throat. She had seen the clouds on the horizon while I was still admiring the sun. She had known my son better than I ever did. "She told me you'd be too close to him to see it," Julian whispered. "She said a father always looks for the best parts of himself in his son, even when those parts are gone." I finally picked up the envelope, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't open it. Not here. Not in a cafe in Boston surrounded by strangers. I tucked it into the breast pocket of my tweed jacket, resting it right against the silver tie clip. "I'll read it in Rockport," I said. "In the workshop, just her and me." Julian stood up and pulled his car keys from his pocket. "I'm driving you back. The Mercedes is out front." I looked out the window. The streets of Boston were teeming now, a sea of winter coats and shopping bags. Life was continuing in its mundane, frantic pace, oblivious to the fact that a dynasty had just been dismantled over a few cups of coffee. "One more thing, Silas," Julian said as we walked toward the door. "Caleb asked to see you, through his public defender. He said there's something he needs to tell you, something that isn't on any recording." I stopped at the threshold of the cafe, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I thought of the USB in my pocket. I thought of the letter against my chest. "I'll think about it on the drive," I said. "But for now, I just want to hear the ocean." It takes exactly an hour and a half to drive from the frenetic energy of Boston to the rugged, salt-cured silence of Rockport, Maine. We took the I-93 north, eventually cutting over to Route 1A as the coastline began to jaggedly assert itself. Julian drove with the steady, unblinking focus of a man who had navigated many storms for me, both at sea and in court. I sat in the passenger seat, the yellowed envelope resting on my lap like a live coal. It was 8 years old, but Eleanor's handwriting remained elegant and rhythmic, a series of deliberate curves that seemed to breathe against the paper. Outside the window, New England was dissolving into an early November twilight. The forests were skeletal and bare. The coastal cottages were beginning to flicker with amber lights, and the Maine sky held that pale, bruised gray that only comes with winter. I opened the envelope as the car crossed the bridge out of the city. Inside were 4 pages of cream stationery, the blue ink slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. Eleanor had written this on September 14th, 2016, 3 months before the cancer finally took her breath. She had been weak then, her body a shadow, but her mind had remained as sharp as a diamond cutter. "My dearest Silas," I read her voice suddenly echoing in the small cabin of the car. She wrote about the subtle shift she'd noticed in Caleb as early as 2013. It had started small, a question about the market value of the Rockport house after I'd mentioned the high cost of re-shingling the roof. A son who loves his father asks, "Are you okay? Dad, can I help with the work?" Eleanor wrote. A son who views his father as an asset asks, "What is this place worth on paper, Dad?" Caleb asked the second question. I never forgot the look in his eyes that day, Silas. It was the look of a man counting his chips before the game had even ended. She wrote about Sloane with a clarity that made my skin cold. She has the eyes of a navigator who is always looking for an emergency exit. I watched her at our dinner table, and I realized she never looked at Caleb with affection. She looked at him the way a pilot looks at a vessel, a useful tool to get her where she needs to go. She didn't marry our son Silas. She married the potential of what he would inherit. Then she addressed the question that had been burning in my chest, why she hadn't told me. "I tried to tell you once," the letter continued. "Do you remember that evening in September? We sat on the porch after dinner, watching the tide come in. I started to say something about Caleb and his obsession with the Maritime Group's dividends. You took my hand, Silas. You kissed my forehead and told me I was tired, that I shouldn't worry about the boy. You chose to see the son you wanted, not the man he was becoming. And I didn't try again, not because I gave up, but because I know you. You are a man who needs to touch the wood to know it's rotting. Some truths cannot be spoken, they can only be discovered. The memory hit me like a rogue wave." September 2016. She had been so frail, her voice a mere whisper. I had brushed her off with a kiss, thinking it was just the illness making her anxious. I hadn't listened. I had traded her insight for my own comfort. "I asked Julian to hold this," she wrote. "I told him only give this to Silas when the storm breaks, when Caleb finally moves against him. Julian thought I was being dramatic, but a mother knows her children, Silas. She knows the best of them, and she knows the darkest corners they are capable of hiding in." Julian kept driving, his eyes fixed on the darkening highway, his silence a shield of respect. We crossed the state line into Maine, the air outside growing colder, the scent of pine and salt beginning to seep through the vents. The final page of the letter felt heavier than the rest. If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. But if you are alive to read it, it means you survived, because you always survive, Silas. You are the strongest man I have ever known, even when you are pretending to be just a simple carpenter. Keep the workshop. Keep the house. Keep the tie clip, it holds everything together, remember? And keep our name clean, for both of us. I am so sorry I couldn't stay longer to fight this battle beside you. Love you always. Eleanor. I folded the pages carefully and tucked them back into the envelope. I looked out the window at the passing shoreline. We didn't speak as we crossed through New Hampshire and into the familiar rocky embrace of Maine. The Mercedes finally pulled into the gravel driveway in Rockport at 6:47 p.m. The harbor lights in the distance were shimmering gold against the black water. I stepped out of the car, the bite of the Atlantic wind hitting my face, grounding me. I walked into the workshop. The smell hit me first, white pine varnish and old salt. The dinghy I had been working on this morning sat exactly where I had left it, a half-finished dream, on a wooden rack. I placed Eleanor's letter on the workbench right next to the silver tie clip I had finally unpinned from my tie. I stood in the center of the shop for a long time, doing nothing. I just listened to the Atlantic swell hitting the pilings beneath the floorboards. Eleanor had known. She had seen the rot 8 years ago, and she had held her tongue because she knew my heart wasn't ready to break yet. She hadn't stayed silent to protect Caleb. She had stayed silent to protect me, waiting until I was strong enough to survive the wreckage. "Silas," Julian said from the doorway. He didn't come in. He knew this space belonged to the ghosts. Caleb's lawyer called again. He says Caleb has something to tell you that isn't on any recording, something from before August, before Dragan, before any of the plans. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the unfinished boat on the wood that still needed to be shaped. "Before August," I repeated. The first night of winter was settling over Rockport, cold and absolute. Tell them I'll think about it, Julian, I said. I reached out and touched the pine hull of the dinghy. It was cold, but it was solid. Unlike my son, the wood was honest. I stood there in the dark, a 62-year-old carpenter with a kingdom in the shadows and a letter from a dead woman, wondering how many more layers of the past I still had to strip away. I took 3 weeks to make the decision. 3 weeks of early mornings in the woodshop of drinking black coffee alone, while watching the winter Atlantic churn against the rocks, and of reading Eleanor's letter until I had memorized the weight of every comma. In the end, I decided to go, not because I had forgiven, and certainly not because I had forgotten. I went because Eleanor had written, "Some truths can only be discovered," and I wanted to hear the final truth from my son's own lips without a recording device or a federal agent between us. The visitation room at the Essex County Correctional Facility in Salem was a place of cold concrete and humming fluorescent lights. It was a Wednesday morning, and a light dusting of snow was beginning to blur the world outside the reinforced glass. Caleb walked out in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The gel was gone from his hair, the expensive Brioni suit replaced by coarse cotton, and his eyes were rimmed with the deep, sallow shadows of a man who hadn't slept since Thanksgiving. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way he occupied the space. He looked diminished. We sat on opposite sides of the glass. Neither of us reached for the phone at first. We just stared at each other, the 62 years of my life and the 39 years of his colliding in a heavy, suffocating silence. Finally, Caleb picked up the receiver. "I found the papers for the Maritime Group in 2022, Caleb said. He didn't start with an apology or a plea for mercy. He started with the facts. "I was cleaning out that old storage trunk in the Rockport attic. I found a stray dividend check from a decade ago." He looked at his cuffed hands. I searched for the name online. Vane Maritime Group. "I saw it was a real empire, but your name wasn't on the executive board, only Julian's. I thought maybe you had worked there a long time ago. I thought you were just ashamed that you hadn't made it to the top. I thought you were hiding a failure, Dad. You thought I was a loser," I said, my voice flat. "I thought you had a story you were too embarrassed to tell," Caleb admitted. "Then the PI sent the report in September, 73%, 584 million. And I wasn't happy for you, Dad. I was furious. I'd spent 2 years bleeding out in that fund, struggling to keep my head above water, and you were sitting on a kingdom without saying a word. I called Sloan that night." He closed his eyes for a second. "She told me he chose this. He chose to watch you struggle. This isn't a father. It's a test you didn't know you were taking." Then I was angry enough to believe her. Then came the part that hadn't been captured on any of Calloway's recordings. The first time Sloan suggested the palliative route was in July, before Dragan, before the debt spiraled. I walked out of the room, Dad. I drove around Boston for 2 hours. I went home, and she didn't mention it again for 3 weeks. His voice trembled. I don't know exactly when I stopped walking out. I don't know when her voice became louder in my head than yours. I sat in silence and listened. I didn't interrupt. I let him lay out the wreckage of his own conscience. "You said there was a trust," Caleb whispered. $50 million. "There was," I replied. Caleb repeated the word, hanging in the air like an executioner's blade. I reached into the pocket of my tweed jacket and pulled out a plain white envelope. I slid it through the narrow slot at the base of the glass for the guard to inspect and hand over. Inside were the terms. "2 choices, Caleb," I said. "Option 1. You cooperate fully with the FBI. You provide the timeline from July Sloan's role and every detail Agent Calloway requires. In exchange, I will decline to file any further civil suits. You will serve your criminal sentence, but when you are released, there will be a trust of $500,000 waiting for you. Enough to start over, and you keep the Vane name." Caleb looked at the papers, his hands finally steady. "And option 2, you fight, you protect Sloan. I file every civil suit I have alongside Dragan's USB and the forensic evidence. You will leave prison with nothing, no assets, no money, and no name. You will walk out of those gates as Caleb with no surname worth mentioning. I will strike you from every record I own." Caleb read the document. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. "Why give me anything at all after what I did?" "Because your mother asked me to," I said. "In her letter, she asked me to remember that you were her son. Not for your sake, Caleb, for hers." A long silence stretched between us as the snow began to fall more heavily outside the high windows of the Salem facility. Caleb looked at the pen the guard provided, then back at me. "I'll take option 1, Caleb said. I nodded. I stood up, looking at my son one last time through the glass. "Sloan won't be given a choice, Caleb. You understand that?" "I know," he said. He paused, his lips trembling. "Is there anything I can say?" "Not today, Caleb," I interrupted. "Maybe someday, years from now, but not today." I hung up the receiver. I put on my gray tweed jacket, adjusted my wool tie, and pinned the silver clip back into place. I walked out of the visitation room, through the white-painted halls of the prison, and into the sharp, cold morning of Salem. The snow was light on my shoulders as I reached the Ford F-150. I took the tie clip off for a moment and looked at it. The silver was tarnished and worn, but it caught the winter light. Eleanor had been right about everything, about Caleb, about Sloan. And she was right about the clip. It did hold everything together, not because it recorded the truth, but because it reminded me of the man I was supposed to be. I drove north on Route 1A, leaving the prison behind. The radio was off. Eleanor's letter was tucked safely in my breast pocket. I had a boat to finish in Rockport. I had a pot of black coffee waiting on the stove. And I had a December morning in Maine with the smell of pine, the sound of the swell, and the 31 years of a life we built together still standing. Silas Vane, the shipbuilder from Rockport, was going home. And for the first time in a long time, the horizon was clear. Standing in my quiet workshop, I've realized that I built a global empire, but failed to secure the foundation of my own home. My family story is a testament to the fact that blind love can be just as lethal as arsenic. I stayed silent to protect a son who was busy plotting my end, proving that even a master shipbuilder can miss the rot in the hull until the ship begins to sink. Only God can judge the heart, but I have judged the evidence. My advice? Don't be like me. Don't let your silence become a breeding ground for a family betrayal. Open your eyes before the storm breaks, because a family story built on secrets will eventually shatter. This family betrayal taught me that truth is the only anchor that holds. Don't wait until you're a victim in your own family story to face the painful family betrayal hiding behind a smile. What would you do in my shoes? Comment your thoughts, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more deep and sophisticated tales. Thank you for watching until the very end. A final warning: the following stories contain fictionalized elements constructed for educational purposes. If you prefer different content, feel free to explore other narratives that better suit your journey.